So I'm just so delighted to see so many friends here. It's wonderful. And as you know, the theme for the evening is taxes. And so before we even start, I have to make a confession that in my life, I have never filled out a 1040. Not even the 1040 easy form. For the simple reason that I do not believe that this is something that should be left to amateurs. And there are people out here, even as we speak, I'm sure, reading the tax code for fun and profit, and I say, more power to them, and we should, encourage that. On a more personal, self-serving note, the other reason I like to have somebody's name on my taxes filled out by line on my tax forms is if I ever am audited, I want to have a professional there with me to possibly save me some money and at the very least keep me out of jail. But having that name on your tax form has its drawbacks. You should really know who that person is. And therein lies the tale. Years ago, when I was very young and very foolish, I had a fairly good job in Chicago, and I decided I really needed to go to Colorado and be a ski bum for a little while. So I quit, went to Colorado, skied for a little while, got really bored with that, and wound up opening a restaurant and flipping burgers for the next year. Which didn't seem like a really, big future for me either. So I called my old boss back in Chicago and got an even better job than I had when I left. And with a new husband in tow now, moved back to Chicago. And we got there in the fall of the year, and we rented a little apartment up in Evanston from a very successful real estate woman named May. Now, May was in her 80s at the time, I think, and she was just as sharp as you could, just incredible. And after all those years of being a real estate lady in the North Shore of Chicago, she had a phenomenal Rolodex. I mean, if you needed a carpet person, a draperies, you needed a dog walker, you needed tutors for your kids, doctors, lawyers, whatever you needed, you called May, and May would have a name in her Rolodex for you. So January came and went, and my husband and I thought we needed to find a tax person because we didn't know anything about filling out tax forms as entrepreneurs. I mean, we had employees, and there was sales tax, and all these kinds of really complicated things that we had to deal with. So I called May, and she, of course, had somebody in her Rolodex, Philip Barish. Oh, he had been doing her taxes for decades. If there was a dime to be saved on your taxes, Philip could do it. So we gave Philip a call and made an appointment to go and see him in a couple of weeks. So we went to his office. It was on the west side of Chicago, a pretty nondescript kind of storefront. And we walked in, and it was the kind of place that the interior office had not seen a can of paint in 30 years, for a good reason. Philip Barish practiced external filing, which meant all around the walls there were banker boxes and file folders stacked up, so that if you were to try to move them to paint the walls, you would destroy 30 years of accurate record keeping. Well, there was a light in the back office, and we went back, and here was Philip Barish waiting for us. Now, if you had called Central Casting and said, "Send me a Chicago businessman," they would have sent you Philip Barish. He was an ample man, and he was sitting in one of those big leather executive rocker swivel office chairs behind a huge desk with yet more file folders stacked around him. His tie was loose and the shirt sleeves were rolled up, and he had kind of basset-towned eyes and bulldog kind of jaws and a big stogie. And it was not the first one. He had one of those big amber ashtrays filled with old cigar butts in it. Anyway, come on in, kids, sit down. Say, how's May? I haven't seen her in a long time. How's she doing? So we began to chat and get to know each other, and Philip wanted to know our situation, where we'd come from, and how we were settling in, and was May treating us well, and indeed it was. And then he shared a little about himself. He'd been a lifelong Chicagoan, knew all the ins and outs of Chicago, whatever you needed to know about Chicago, he was your man. And for hobbies, he liked to go to Las Vegas and drop large sums of money on the tables. So much so that the casinos flew him there every few months. They would fly him there. And he showed us his latest returned check. It was more than 2 years worth of salary for me that he had sort of dropped over a 3-day weekend. But he wasn't charging enough that I felt we were supporting a gambling addiction, so we went ahead with this. And so finally he said, okay, show me what you got, show me what you got. Well, my husband put our little shoebox of receipts up on the desk, and I had the red vinyl ledger that I had kept for the restaurant. Now, you may have guessed by now that I'm not a numbers person, so keeping this ledger had been, an act of just pure torture. But I had recorded all the daily receipts and the hamburger prices and the sales tax and the salaries to the, that part-time help, and I laid it on his desk. Well, where's the other one? The other one? What other one? Well, the other set of books. I was supposed to keep 2 sets of books. That's okay. I can play it that way too. So he asked a few questions, went through the receipts, looked at the book, asked a few questions, said, okay, I'll call you in a few weeks when the taxes are ready. And we left, and sure enough, a few weeks later, we got a call, and we went in and we signed our name above Philip Barish, tax prepared by, and sent it off, and everything was fine. Well, once you have a system in place, you don't like to mess with it. So the next year, we went back to Philip again, and the next year, and the next year, and he was our tax guy. Well, one summer night, my husband was coming home from work quite late, and it was hot, and his car window was rolled down, and he was driving down the street, and he heard this blood-curdling scream come off from the left, and he stopped, he turned to look to see what it was. And the car in front of him also heard it and also turned to look, but they stopped, and my husband didn't. And so he crashed into the car in front of him, and he turned around to look, and across the top of the car was a bar with blue and red lights on it. And the door opened, and a Chicago policeman got out, kind of rubbing his neck, and came back and gave my husband a citation, which was followed a little while later with a note in the mail from the city of Chicago with a court date. Well, all of our friends that knew Chicago were saying, well, you need to get a lawyer. You need a lawyer. Really, you get a lawyer for this. And we didn't know any lawyers. We didn't even know what kind of a lawyer you would hire. But we thought about it for a little while, and I thought, well, we'll call Philip Barish. And we did, and Philip had just the guy. Gave us the name of a lawyer that he used all the time for this kind of thing. And my husband called the lawyer, and the lawyer got the information about when and where in the courtroom and the day and the time. And then he said, and bring $20 in cash. So my husband went down to the court date, and he got there, and he met the lawyer, and the lawyer went down, took the $20, and went down and had a little conversation with the judge and the bailiff. The money changed hands. He came back, and he says, okay. And sure enough, a few minutes later, the judge said, case dismissed. Now that is a city that works. Well, life went on, and, we had a few other little skirmishes with traffic violations, and it was handled. Now, a couple of years after that, this interesting news story broke. The Chicago Sun-Times had purchased a bar in the north side of Chicago, and they had put cameras and microphones throughout the place and hired people to, set it up as though they were opening a bar. And they recorded every transaction with every health inspector, the electrician, the plumbing inspector, and all the conversations, and how they paid everybody off. And it just was shocking to the rest of the world. I mean, Chicago was kind of like, yeah, but it was such a shocking story to the rest of the country that 60 Minutes decided to send a team to Chicago to interview one of the masterminds behind the bar, which was called the Mirage, in case some of you might remember the Mirage. So my husband and I, of course, were amused by the whole thing, and we turned on 60 Minutes to watch this interview, and there was Maury Schaefer interviewing the mastermind, who told them about which inspectors you pay off and how much, and which ones you don't ever pay the police because they just keep coming back, and how to set up 2 sets of books. It was our guy, Philip. I am sitting there thinking, this is the man who has signed every one of our tax returns for the last 8 years. Now this is a taxing situation. So we waited for the IRS people to show up at my office, maybe with badges, or the letter in the mail. But months went by and nothing happened. A year went by, and I had to conclude that when Philip said, that's okay, I can play it that way too, He really could.